Risk Management Professional Exam Preparation Course. Perform qualitative risk analysis. In this video, we will explain the perform qualitative risk analysis process. The video is divided into the following topics: purpose and objective, critical success factors, tools and techniques, and documenting the result. And again, tools and techniques is the focus area, should be the focus area for those of you who's going to take the exam. So let's look at where we are in the overview here on the project risk management processes. So we are now in the third risk, which is perform qualitative risk analysis. And the key purpose and activities here are probability, to determine probability, impact, root causes, importance, and result in a prioritized list of risks of all the risks that was identified in the previous process, which is identify risk process. So let's look at the purpose and objective of the qualitative risk analysis in the summary. So the purpose and objective is for assessing the probability and effects of individual risks. It is to categorizing risks to sources or causes, and it is to identify effects from individual and group of risks. And as a side note here is that the qualitative analysis leads to the quantitative analysis. So this is the first step in our process of assessing the risks that was identified in the previous process. So the critical success factors for the qualitative risk analysis are: use agreed upon approach, use agreed upon definition of risk terms, and collect high quality information about risks. And lastly, perform iterative qualitative risk analysis. So these are the four critical success factors. So let's look at them first one by one. So use agreed upon approach. So here we have a little bit different format. So one is urgency proximity. So some risk requires near-term response in considered more urgent than others. So the approach should be that the risk requires near-term response is by default considered more urgent on the prioritized list. Second one is manageability. So some risks are not manageable and should be dropped. The project team can then decide to go forward, stop, rescope, or inform a decision maker for a decision. So this is all for handling risk that is not manageable within the project team. So they can decide to keep the risk and go forward, stop, rescope, inform the decision maker for a decision. The third part of the approach is the impact external to the project. So a risk may increase in importance if it affects organizations beyond the project. So if the risk in your project is something that could impact a third-party organization or an organization outside your project, it can be another department, it can be another process within your organization, then this risk can no longer be contained within the project, and thereby it is now becoming more important than risks that possibly can be contained within the project. So also we need to agree on a definition of the different risk terms. So there needs to be a use agreed upon definition of risk terms. That's another critical success factor. And what it means is that the risk assessment should be based on agreed definition of important terms. Those definitions should be applied consistently when assessing the risk. And whatever we do, as the third critical success factor here says, is we need to make sure that we collect high quality information about risks. So collection of high quality information about risk is required. Information might not be available in any historical database and need to be gathered through interviews, workshop, or from experts that we bring in. any data gathered from individuals is subject to bias. They might not be and they might be. It depends on the individual and if the individual is aware of it and how it is communicated with the individual what the data is for. So there's many things that can make sure that it doesn't happen, but if you don't do anything, most likely data gathered from individuals will be subject to some kind of bias. The next one of the success factors here are perform iterative qualitative risk analysis. So again, when we talk about risk management and we talk about iterative, we mean that it has to be repeated. So the success and effectiveness of the qualitative risk analysis will be enhanced if the process is used periodically during the project. So to make it successful and effective, the qualitative risk analysis is not a one-time task. And also the qualitative analysis should be linked to key project milestones, phases, and deliverables. So again, you can schedule it regularly, but you should also look into account what are the different project phases, key deliverables, and milestones. When does it make sense to put in an activity to do another qualitative risk analysis? And of course, this is linked to also the identify risk process, but not necessarily both have to be done. Identify risk, which we've just been through in the last lesson, is about identifying which risk we have. Qualitative risk analysis is to do the further analysis on those risks identified. So as the identify risk process has to be scheduled where you think now I will have new risks that I can identify during my project plan, the qualitative risk analysis process have to be done where I think now certain deliverables has happened or certain things have changed or been completed or have progressed on my project, that now I might need to have a change to the risk priority, impact, and basically the parameters for the risk, rather than if the risk exists or not, or rather than if a new risk exists or not. But normally they are linked. So, and lastly, just as for the identify risk, qualitative analysis should also be considered whenever there's a major change to the project. So not just the milestone phases regularly scheduled, but also when there is a scope change request. And it should be part of the scope change request process. So let's have a look at some of the tools and techniques for the qualitative risk analysis. So here, before we go into the PMI input-output tools format, let's just have a look at another summary. So what we basically want to run through during our qualitative risk analysis is that we will first, based on the risk identified, select the risk characteristics. Then we will collect and analyze data about each risk. We will prioritize the risks. We will categorize the risk causes. And we will document the result. So these 5 steps, remember those for those that's taking the exam, that this summary will have questions in the exam as well. Now, let's now look into the PMI approach here, or the format that PMI uses for discussing input, tools and techniques and outputs. Again, we have the red lamps. This is very important for everyone who takes the exam. You must memorize the key input, tools and techniques and outputs. So we have 4 inputs in the qualitative risk analysis. We have a number of tools and techniques that needs to be applied, and the output is that we have the risk register, which we created in the previous process, fully updated. So let's look at the inputs first. So the 4 inputs we have is risk register from the previous phase, risk management plan from the previous phases, project scope statement from the project, and the organizational process assets. So let's look at them one by one. So risk register, this is from the risk identify process. That is the key input, and that's what we need to update as we go along our qualitative risk analysis And at the end, we need to provide an updated risk register. Second one is the risk management plan. This is our structure, this is our Bible, which gives us everything we need in order to understand how we're going to handle the risk processes and the approach. And this is what was completed and the main output in the plan risk management process. Project scope statement. Again, just like for the identify risk process, we need the project scope statement as it's a document that clearly describes the scope of the project and the key deliverables. So the information in the project scope statement will provide input of a scope that the risk management process needs to address. We need to know this as we go through the qualitative risk analysis, because we might have identified the risk, but now we need to start looking at the impact of those risks, and the impact could be to the scope. And finally, organizational process assets. So here we need to look at a number of organizational process assets that can influence the risk management plan. And key areas to consider are risk categories, common definition of concepts and terms, template format standards, authority levels, roles and responsibility, lessons learned, as well as the stakeholder register. So this is the same number of assets, same kind of assets that we made use of in the previous two processes. So with all that input now at hand, let's look at the tools and techniques we are going to deploy to get our qualitative risk analysis done. So we have 6 tools and techniques: risk probability and impact assessment, probability and impact matrix, risk data quality assessment, risk categorization, risk urgency assessment, and expert judgment. So let's look at them one by one as well. So risk probability and impact assessment. So risk probability assessment investigates the likelihood that each risk will occur. So the risk impact assessment investigates the potential effect, and the risk impact assessment investigates the potential effect on a project for each risk should the risk occur. So the assessment is done in workshop meetings or interviews like the identify risk. Sometimes this is combined. And another tool that we are going to make use of is what is called the probability and impact matrix. So the probability and impact matrix will provide a lookup table or matrix, if we want, that can be used to determine the rating of the individual risk. So you plot in probability and impact, and then you can look up and you can determine the rating of a risk. Risk data quality assessment. So we mentioned that we need high quality data. So the risk data quality assessment is basically the qualitative risk analysis, is basically for the risk qualitative risk analysis to be effective and credible, needs accurate and unbiased data. Why it is important that we have some sort of data quality assessment of the data in place. Now, the data quality assessment should look at accuracy, quality, reliability, and integrity of the data sources and data. Not just the data you receive, but also the source that it comes from. Risk categorization. So during our quality risk analysis, risk categorization is to categorize the risk into groups based on the impact to the project of the risk, as well as to which areas of the project the risk will impact. So grouping risk by common root causes can also be a very effective risk response. So if you have a group of risks that is team or technical or process, then you will group the risk into whatever grouping you decide, as well as you might make a secondary grouping which is based on the root causes. So these risks originates from the whatever the root cause might be, a technical design, and from the technical design the risk might both be in team, you can't find the skills, that's the risk, you can't solve the problem, that's the technical related, or the technical design might impact the business process. So you can have a root cause linked to several groups. It's not a one-to-one relationship. Number 5 is the risk urgency assessment. So The assessment is to determine the urgency of addressing the risks. So, as mentioned earlier, near-term responses are generally more urgent, and indicators of urgency are such as time to effect a risk response, symptoms and warning signs, and as well the risk rating. So, high rating risk requires more urgency, whereas if it's have some warning signs, or if it's something that will affect the project very in the near term, those will have a higher risk rating. Lastly, expert judgment. So use of experts with relevant experience from similar projects can be used to identify risk. Now, it can also be used to identify responses as well as the risk parameters. So just for the identify risk, and it's mentioning identify risk here because this is really the key purpose of the experts. It is to identify the risk as well as support the response of the risk as well as the qualitative risk analysis of the priority and so on. But for the process to work just as for the identify risk, it is important that the experts you select carefully. It doesn't have to be the same experts from the identify to the qualitative risk analysis. It can be different experts, but you need to select them carefully, and you need to take measures to make sure that bias is reduced or mitigated, that it doesn't become a bias response from the expert. So you need to take bias into account. The output, as mentioned, we only have one, and that is the risk register from the previous phase that is updated. And the updated risk register should include now a relative ranking or priority list of project risks, risk group by categories, causes of risk or project areas require particular attention, list of risks requiring response in the near term, list of risk for additional analysis and response, as well as a watch list of low priority risk and trends in qualitative risk analysis results. So let's just look at that a little bit more in detail on the output of the qualitative risk analysis. So we have a structure to the list of identified risk. This is what we will add. We will add the structure to the list of identified risk, and this is the risk register. We will add categories, priorities, but then we will also make two split here. One is we put the risk on a watch list, meaning low priority risk. We will have them on a watch list, and then the other risk is these we go into the quantitative analysis. So this is the higher priority risk that we now want to investigate further. So by that, let's do a summary. So after completing this video, you should now have a good understanding of the performed qualitative risk analysis process.